Welcome to the People by People podcast with me, your host, Laura Sutherland. How are you on this fine day? It's another hump day, it's Wednesday, and I'm delighted to be back to the People by People podcast. Today, talking about the 7 key talking points of the Climate Change Committee's report, which came out today about the progress to net zero in the UK. Now, the first thing that the report has is 600 pages. So I'm briefly bringing you a roundup from Edie, who is not my dog. It's an organisation that I follow, and the content is brilliant. If you don't follow them and sign up to their emails, etc., then do that. It's edie.net, edie.net. Today the report came out, the 600-page report, and Edie has done a really nice sort of 7 key message summary for us. Now, while some of it's positive, there's also some parts there that show us some negative sides of things and things that have to be worked on sooner rather than later. The Climate Change Committee had continuously made recommendations to government on how a net zero target could be set and achieved by 2050. But in the latest report, the Climate Change Committee provides an in-depth progress report across each sector and whether policies are enabling or hindering decarbonisation. Now, those sectors and sort of sector-to-sector analysis is in the report, and I'll put the report link in the show notes for you. But firstly, the UK is almost halfway to net zero emissions. So that is stating that the UK emissions are 47% lower than they were in 1990, despite a 4% increase last year, which is attributed actually to the recovery from COVID and the pandemic. Emissions are still 10% lower than they were in 2019, which effectively means that the UK is almost halfway in its journey to reach net zero. Now, the UK government is attempting to accelerate decarbonisation across all areas of the economy, with the flagship net zero strategy acting as the umbrella that all their policies fall under. Now, net zero strategy, there are a lot of strategies out there. There's the race to zero, net zero, there's zero emissions, there's the 6 carbon this and that and the next thing. There's a lot of stuff out there, and I think that's why people get confused and are turned off by far too much jargon. If I could recommend that you look at the net zero strategy, which is from the UK government, then you will find a lot of information in there around what we're working towards. Equally, funnily enough, the Scottish Government also has their, they've got a national performance framework, it's called. I'll link to that in the show notes as well, and it talks about how it's working towards the Sustainable Development Goals and how it's performing against them. So the second point from this current report today is that less than 40% of future required emissions reductions are covered by policy. That basically means that our policies are leaving out a lot of this essential decarbonisation. So in the new progress report, it states that there are only credible government plans to deliver around 1/3 of the emission reductions needed to meet the 6th carbon budget. A further 25% of the reductions could be delivered with rapid action outside of policy making, but the Climate Change Committee warns that the further reductions cannot be relied on. So delaying action, it emphasises, would ultimately push up the cost of the net zero transition. Pushing up the cost is not a good thing for us. A lot of what's covered by policy comes in the form of the zero emissions vehicle mandate, which helps at tackling the sort of historical sort of source of emissions from road transport. But there are some real problem areas that are still needing addressed, namely in the built environment, in terms of heating homes and improving energy efficiency. Now, a lot of people are probably aware of all the energy efficient sort of offers and funding that have been made available to the public and to businesses as well, but I'm not entirely sure that the uptake in that has been trusted, because why would people trust free money to do stuff like that? And also understood about the benefits of doing that and why they would go to the bother of it. And it's about that sort of storytelling aspect of why should somebody do something, what's it going to benefit them, and what's it going to take. And they need to know the ins and outs of it, but they don't need to know every blooming detail. And I think some of these companies scare people off with their advertising and the lack of just the human approach to talking about things like this. At the end of the day, people want to know, if I put in this insulation, I'm going to save X amount on my fuel bill. And that's what people need to know. There's still a long way to go before organisations really start to communicate effectively around these things. The third point in the report is that electric vehicle sales are ahead of predictions and trajectories. Let me just quickly read this out for you. So EV sales grew by 12% in the new car market in 2021, while the Climate Change Committee has recommended an 8% growth, so that's an extra 4%. The Climate Change Committee has also welcomed the creation of 28,000 public charging points across the UK, 7,600 of which were added in the last 12 months. However, the committee also notes that it's still well short of the government's commitment of at least 300,000 by 2030. So this is part of the problem we have, is that electric vehicles are available. People want to buy electric vehicles, but people already know there's a barrier because not everybody has a charging and plug-in point, and there are hardly any plug-in points, as we've just heard, around the UK, around Scotland, around cities, around motorways and around rural areas where people can have confidence that if they drive they can then charge somewhere. So there's a massive amount to do with the infrastructure of these things, and that should have been discussed a long time ago, so that by putting these, commitments in place, the government wanted 300,000 delivered by 2030. Well, how is that going to be rolled out? Because at the moment there's only 28,000. So the report states that decarbonisation pathway should not all be about replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric ones. It offers an important opportunity to change the way people view mobility. The government does have strategies in place to promote bus, rail and cycling and walking, but the committee notes that these aren't as comprehensive as the switch to zero emission passenger vehicles and HGVs. The UK will need to limit the growth of road traffic to 2% by 2035 to allow short-term climate targets to be reached. Wowzers. Something for everyone to think about. Taking personal responsibility is a massive thing, as well as, taking advantage of company electric vehicle schemes. 4, buildings are a real problem point. We've just covered that slightly a minute ago. So it's emphasising that the decarbonisation of the housing is particularly important in the current context of energy prices and the crisis, and with Ofgem planning to increase its price cap again this winter, meaning that families could pay up to £2,700 annually for dual fuel bills. There's a shocking gap in policy for better insulated homes. We touched on that briefly earlier as well. The government promised significant public spending in 2019 and committed to new policies last year. Neither has yet occurred. The average annual energy bill for households in the UK is around £40 higher than if insulation rates from pre-2012 had continued for the last decade. Never mind the fuel increases that we're experiencing right now. The government was able to catalyse energy efficiency upgrades in more than 150,000 homes in 2021, a 12% increase from 2020. However, the Climate Change Committee states that this number needs to increase to 500,000 homes annually by 2025 and then 1 million a year by 2030. We need to ramp up these numbers. Number 5, the energy crisis has been accounted for by government. This report is emphasising that the decarbonisation of housing is particularly important in the current context of the energy price crisis. We've already talked about Ofgem planning to up its price cap again in winter. The Treasury has promised a consultation to tackle pricing reforms, although this is yet to be published. The Climate Change Committee states that a clear policy decision must be made before next winter. That needs to be worked on as soon as possible, and there's not much of a movement on that at the moment. 6, there could be too much reliance on unproven technology. Just look at manufacturing and construction as two examples. According to the Climate Change Committee, there's significant risk or failure to deliver based on focusing on these technologies. Current policies have focused on decarbonisation in industrial sites, including a UK-wide race to create the first net zero industrial cluster. However, the Climate Change Committee warns that the focusing on industrial clusters leaves some risk of the UK taking a more expensive decarbonisation route with lower energy security. The strategies around that are showing signs of delay, while the business model for hydrogen deployment is suffering from poor data. And then on point number 7, the UK's land use needs a revamp. Well, I think everyone probably kind of talks about that. I mean, we're talking about, peatland, for example, like in Scotland, there's some massive resource there. But the Climate Change Committee notes that peatland restoration should reach 67,000 hectares by 2025 and an annual tree planting to 30,000 hectares by 2025, 50,000 hectares by 2050. And by 2050, woodland cover will need to increase by 5% to 18% of all UK land area, while peatland, 80% of peatland needs restoring. 80% of it needs restoring. Wowzers. The land use change targets are not being met. This presents a significant risk due to the time profile of carbon sequestration in natural systems, the report added. It will require an increase of 4,000 hectares annually to reach 30,000 annually of tree planting. Now, tree planting is part of many organisations and companies' carbon offsetting now, which is a good thing in a way, but it's quite often relied upon, by X amount of sales will plant X amount of trees. However, if that needs to be taken into account, then what are these companies and organisations committing to add to what the government is already doing? And is that being taken into account, or is that an addition? That's quite unclear. But yeah, it shows good signs of improvement, but it also shows that there are massive opportunities for improvement, reduction, and thinking differently. And I hope that the government takes this report and its findings and actually starts to do something with it, because again, we need to collaborate across all sectors and all of society to ensure that we're all working towards the same goal, and that it's not just left to businesses, not just left to banks, not just left to agriculture. Everyone has to play a part in this. And I think that's where my passion for helping businesses and organisations to understand how sustainability fits within an organisation overall, and not just the climate, but how it works with the people within it, with the funders, with investors, and how that whole piece is around engagement, building relationships, building trust, and actually doing something good for the planet, which, comes back to what I talk about a lot at the moment, and that's about me helping build a legacy and then bringing everyone along in the journey. So that's just a quick roundup of those 7 sort of key messages from the Climate Change Committee report that came out today. Also some quick news, which was reported on Ecology earlier on, that Canada is giving single-use plastic the boot. It will be announced, it has been announced, that a ban on manufacturing and importing 6 main plastic items will begin in December 2022. And it comes with a promise to make sure that all plastic packaging contains at least 50% recycled content by 2030. Plastic Free July is happening in Canada, and I think that's a fantastic start, and we should all be inspired to do more like that as well. The other thing that came out today was the SCDI's report on purpose and purposeful organisations, and why not only is it important, but how they actually benefit from it. So I'm going to link to that in the show notes as well. There's also an event coming up, which is a partnership between the PRCA and the Work Crowd, which is on sustainability. So I'm going to link to that in the show notes. And finally, Zero Waste Scotland has announced that there's new funding opportunity for Scottish textiles industry. The recent carbon metric report shows that textiles account for nearly a third of the carbon impact of Scotland's household waste. That's 32%. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well. All that leaves me to say is thank you so much again for tuning in to the People by People podcast. If you haven't already done so, please do subscribe and also leave me a review. And of course, if you enjoyed this, then some of your network might too. So it would be great if you could start to share some of my content as well so that others can also enjoy it. Thanks so much again. Speak to you soon.